Good afternoon. We will call the hearing to order. Today we welcome Chairman of the FCC Board of Commissioners, Thomas Wheeler, to our committee. He's going to be discussing how the FCC is responding to the needs of small businesses in rural America. And I want to thank you all for taking the time to be with us, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Modern communications technology has provided endless opportunities to small businesses and to rural America. And the growth of the telecommunications industry and the advances in the way we communicate with each other in the past 15 years has been no less than astonishing. We've seen a digital revolution that has fundamentally changed the way America does business. Because of this rapid advancement, small firms can communicate with potential buyers around the world. Family farmers are using wireless technologies to monitor their crop production, and entrepreneurs can launch a website or application from their living room at just about anywhere in the United States. Most importantly, these new technologies provide the gateway and opportunity for economic growth and job creation, especially in the rural areas. Continued congressional oversight of the FCC is essential to ensure that the concerns and ideas of small firms and those enterprises located in rural America are given due consideration during the regulatory process. And this is a theme that this committee has tried to hammer home throughout the past two Congresses, including when Chairman Wheeler's predecessor appeared here 2 years ago. Policymakers need to listen to small businesses. There are 28.2 million small businesses in America, and they make up 99.7% of the U.S. employer firms and create 63% of all the new jobs, net new jobs in this country. And we cite these statistics often because it's our job to remind people in Washington how important the vitality of our small businesses are. By almost every measurable mark, small businesses drive our economy. What we want to do here today is ensure that the FCC gets the job done right when developing the regulatory policies. This means ensuring an open and free Internet that will allow for the free flow of information and services, facilitating the build-out of high-speed Internet to rural and unserved areas, and providing the needed spectrum to industry players, both small and large, to ensure that our tech companies continue to innovate and create jobs. Our committee can be a valuable resource for the FCC as it moves forward with the numerous actions it is working on. We'd like to be your partner in that process. It's important for small businesses to have a seat at the table early in the regulatory process, as they can provide real-world examples of how regulation is going to affect them, and provide regulators with potentially less burdensome and similarly effective options. And I want to thank everyone for being here again. Particularly the chairman, and I now yield to Ranking Member Velasquez for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing offers an opportunity to examine the benefits and challenges of broadband deployment. More small businesses are embracing broadband than ever before, and it is rapidly changing the way business is conducted. Many new businesses are designed around emerging technology based on the access of broadband. For this reason, it is even more important to enable small firms to utilize broadband and the nearly limitless technologies derived from it. Giving small companies this access helps them become more successful and efficient. Enhancing broadband availability is not only good for small businesses, it's good for America. The number of jobs dependent on technology is expected to grow, creating opportunities for large and small companies in every sector of the U.S. economy. We have seen the benefits broadband technology can bring to our daily lives in a variety of ways. However, there are still many people without basic access to reliable Internet connections in both rural and urban areas. Unfortunately, the adoption gap may further widen without adequate support for broadband deployment. While federal programs have helped reduce the digital divide in communities across the country, much work remains to be done. Today's hearing will focus on improving broadband access in order to strengthen the small business economy. The insights gathered today will enable us to ensure that policies are effectively supporting network deployment. Additionally, we will examine other critical telecommunications and technology issues facing small businesses. Among these are the Connect America Fund, spectrum auctions, and of course, net neutrality. While many of these rules are just starting to take shape, our duty is to protect the interests of small firms working within the industry and those who rely on these services as customers. Balancing the needs of all parties is significant to guaranteeing competition within this industry and its customers. This committee will ensure that the needs of small firms are taken into account in all FCC rulemaking procedures because our continued leadership in technological innovation is at stake. In advance of the testimony, I want to thank Chairman Wheeler for taking the time to be here with us today. We look forward to hearing your insights on these important topics. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
All right, our witness today is the Honorable Thomas Wheeler, Chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. He's a graduate of Ohio State University, and he was appointed Chairman by President Obama in November of 2013. He has a 30-year career spanning several segments of the telecommunications industry, including stops as Managing Director of Core Capital Partners, a venture capital firm investing in early-stage Internet protocol-based companies, and is co-founder of SmartBrief, the Internet's largest electronic information service for vertical markets. From 1979 to 1984, he served as President and CEO of the National Cable Television Association, and from 1992 to 2004, he served the same role for the Cellular Telecommunications and Internet Association. Chairman Wheeler, thanks for being here.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ranking Member, appreciate both of your thoughts. It's a privilege to be here, both as Chairman of the FCC and, Mr. Chairman, as you just indicated, as a small businessman myself. I'm one of the 28.2 million that you talked about, because for over 30 years I have helped start or started myself a series of companies. Some worked, some didn't, which is the story of small business life. But I know firsthand that being a small business person is a 24/7 activity and means living on the edge. And I bring that experience to this job. As you indicated, for most of the past decade, I was a partner at a venture capital firm where we invested in and helped grow early-stage startup companies who are, by definition, small businesses. And I think that as an entrepreneur, I had a special awareness or understanding of the challenges that they faced. I'm also an amateur historian, and from those studies, I know that the networks that connect us are the networks that define our economy. And today, those networks have never been more important, because the historic change that we are all living through right now is that our networks are our new economy. You know, previous networks were enablers of economic activity. The railroad would haul raw materials to a central point where it would be fabricated, hauled back out to a mass market. Or the telephone company would enable commerce in physical products. But today our economy is all about non-physical products. And use of information is the key activity of every 21st century business, regardless of its size, even the physical product business. How information flows across networks, then, and how information creates new information is what the new economy is all about. And based on that reality, our goals at the FCC are rather direct: to see that everyone has access to 21st century connectivity, including the necessity to subsidize service where it isn't otherwise economically feasible, to assure that networks freely interconnect to become a collection of open networks, networks that are open to all, to preserve the historic principles such as public safety, and to assure that they are maintained despite the evolution in technology, and to protect network users, whether they're small business people or consumers, from those who might exploit them. And, of course, provide for the national security. Those are what I have termed the network compact. They are the principles that are at the core of the relationship between those who build and operate networks and those who use them. As a businessman, I would also add to that that I believe fervently in the power of competition. There is a mantra around the Commission that goes like this: competition, 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 or more frequently, competition, 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 as our North Star. Because at times of rapid technological change, regulation can never be as efficient as competitive innovation in keeping pace. Thus, we must protect competition where it exists. We must promote it where it can't exist. And we must make sure that where broadband competition is unrealistic, that we shoulder the responsibility to promote its deployment. But going back to my small business roots, I believe that our telecommunications networks are the on-ramp to opportunity. That whether it's the local insurance agency that needs to communicate to be able to receive and process claims, or a guy and a gal and a dog in a garage inventing the next thing in the Internet, that the key component determining each party's success is their access to modern, high-speed, open communications networks. Our networks have never been more important than they are now. And that's why I look forward to discussing these issues with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start questions with Mr. Tipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Wheeler, thank you so much for taking your time, and pretty heartened by some of the comments that you're making in terms of addressing localism, the importance of connectivity, and the economies that we're in. And I'd like to speak a little bit on what may, at first blush, perhaps seem to be just a provincial issue, but we have examples of this literally across the country. I come from the 3rd District of Colorado.
Yes, sir.
We have Montezuma and La Plata counties in that district that are labeled as orphan counties when it comes to being able to get in-state transmissions of television. And as a result of current policies and the DMA market that we're relegated to, which is currently Albuquerque, we simply do not receive Colorado news, Colorado weather forecasts, Colorado emergency broadcasts, and probably equally important to many people in my district, our folks are forced to watch the Dallas Cowboys lose rather than the Denver Broncos win. And so this is an important issue in all sincerity. We have one example that came out of our district when we were having the fire in Colorado Springs. Had folks in the 2 counties, had relatives. They could not get updates in terms of what was going on, possibly endangered family members. So given in your testimony that you stated that promoting this localism in a broad spectrum is the Commission's mission, I'd like to hear what the FCC is thinking about the retransmission policy for places like Southwest Colorado. We have 3 DMAs in state that they could be part of rather than being stuck with an out-of-state market.
Yeah, I thank you, Mr. Tippin, and I understand the challenge, and it's beyond silly. The difficulty that we face is the authority that we have to deal with it under various statutes. And I know that there is talk right now in the other body about an amendment that might open the door and help on the retransmission side. There are also some copyright questions involved. It is a thorny kind of issue that I think boils down to if I could find a solution, I would. And every time we go looking for it, we come across some limitations as to what our statutory authority may be. But I understand the issue, and I'd like to be helpful in it to the extent that it's possible.
You know, I appreciate that. Your predecessor had indicated willing to work with us to be able to resolve these issues. We were not able to get in touch with his office, even though we tried. And so you're making a commitment to us that you are willing to work with us to be able to address these very credible concerns in our district.
Mr. Tipton, the day you call, I will be back to you post haste.
Great. And we'll have you help reach out so our Senate side will work with us as well on this. I also want to be able to move on the broadband issue. Back in May, we had over 130 representatives and senators that wrote in support of broadband mechanism to promote network deployment in areas served by small, independent rural carriers. And I heard your comments, but I'd like you to be able to expand and receive comments on the proposed standalone broadband funding mechanism and whether the FCC has made any progress towards moving toward that goal.
So we have just closed the comment period on the proceeding, I think, last week. And we'll be moving through that process. I know that standalone broadband is an important issue. I know that it also is an issue that has a couple of sides, because some people say, well, wait a minute, if you're no longer going to support voice, what's the impact of that going to be on older people and minorities who can't otherwise afford broadband? And we have to work our way through those. But I'm hopeful that, as I say, this proceeding has just recently closed, and we want to move on it with dispatch.
Right. Do you see some policy changes that need to happen to promote broadband deployment into these rural areas that are underserved and developing an environment literally to attract sorely needed competition into these rural areas?
Well, the key word that you just said is competition, because the interesting thing is that our telecom policy, our policy to support expansion into rural areas is one that was based on a hello grandma kind of a concept of voice calls. And in that situation, we were talking about twisted pair copper as the only way to get it done. In a broadband environment, there are hopefully an increasing number of ways to get it done. You can get it on DSL over copper, you can get it on fiber, you can get it from satellite, you can get it in microwave. There are multiple ways of being able to do that. And so one of the things that we have to be working our way through is saying, okay, how do we make sure that we, A, maintain service and the investment that the American people have made in the service, while at the same point in time making sure that we're not excluding new, potentially improved service providers. And so our solution to that has been that we ought to run some taste tests, and we ought to run some trials. And so we've got $100 million that we have said we will use to fund atypical rural broadband deployment trials, with the emphasis on trials, to find out whether there, in fact, beyond the hypothetical, can be put in place alternatives to the system that has always existed. And we will be taking the final bids on these I'm sorry, not bids, the final offers to provide service middle of next month. And I hope that we will have made our decision by the end of the year, and that there will be trials operational next year.
Great. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence. Mr. Chairman Wheeler, thank you for being here.
Thank you,
yield back.
Thank you, Member Vasquez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wheeler, what steps is the FCC taking to ensure that there is a smooth transition for the affected businesses so that they do not experience increased costs or a reduction in alternative services?
Well, I mean, I think that is the biggest challenge that we face. Well, there's two challenges. One is, how do we make sure that we're keeping up with technology and that the people are getting the kinds of service levels that is warranted by new technology? And then, if there are going to be transitions, how do we make sure that they mitigate the impact on consumers as well as those who have been relying on? And so one of the things that we're doing, for instance, is this taste test, as I said, is this trial of $100 million to let's find out, for instance, what is the impact if commercial high-speed broadband service is offered by the municipal co-op, and how does that affect both those who would use the service as well as competitors that it might be overbuilding on top of? And I think it's a try before you buy kind of a situation.
But more specifically, can you tell us what type of outreach are you doing to with small business community?
With the small business community? Well, I mean, I think that the small business community, as I said, the key to success of any business, but particularly important for small business, is to make sure that they are the recipients of the bandwidth necessary for them to conduct business. How do we do that? So we have outreach to the small business community on multiple issues, as ranging from cybersecurity to what's going on in broadband, that we work with the SBA in our activities, that we make sure that in our proceedings it is open to all, and that we have voices of small business people heard.
Have you performed any small business impact analysis conforming the regulatory flexibility?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, good. Thank you. The court has stated that the Commission could not adopt net neutrality rules that ban discrimination and blocking if the Commission does not reclassify broadband as Title II service. Whether to adopt Title II is a highly debated topic now. What are the repercussions for adopting Title II for the overall market, and what are the challenges finding a balance between your current proposal and the more stringent Title II?
So what the court said was that the way in which the 2010 rules were implemented was inappropriate, but that the Commission had authority to deal with anything that interfered with what they called the virtuous cycle, that new applications drive better bandwidth, which drives new applications, and you have this virtual cycle. Activities like you named, blocking, choosing one player over another, degrading service, fast lanes, this sort of thing, I believe all interfere with the virtuous cycle. And the question then becomes, do we use the 706 authority that the court pointed to, or do we use Title II? And in our notice of proposed rulemaking, we have specifically asked for input on the Title II question. And Title II is very much on the table. That comment period just closed this week. And I look forward to moving forward on that as well. But I will assure you that Title II is very much a topic of conversation and on the table, and something that we specifically asked for comment on in the proceeding.
Thank you. While it is important to protect competition within the market, there are really only a handful of dominant carriers that dictate prices due to a lack of true competition. How will the FCC further regulate this industry and strengthen competition, especially for those small carriers competing against the giants of the industry?
Well, I think there are a multitude of issues there. One is, obviously, we want to continue to orient our universal service support to broadband. Second of all, that competitive carriers and those providing competitive services rely on what's called special access, which is the connection between businesses, if you will. It's not, consumers don't get involved in this. And there is, for a long time, been an inability for the Commission to move on special access. We are now moving on special access. We are collecting data. I set a deadline of the 15th of December for the data that we need, and we are going to address the special access question as well.
Would you anticipate any more delays?
I hope not. In all candor, the thing that has held us back to this point has been getting OMB approval to collect the data. We went back to OMB and we said, look, this is important stuff. And we were able to negotiate with OMB the kind of data that got collected. And it was just the other day that we put out the public notice to begin collecting that data, and that's due on the 15th of December. I don't want any more delays on this. We've waited on special access long enough.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rice.
I'm concerned about the adoption of Title II with respect to the Internet, and you were saying that your concern is that there are certain activities interfere with this so-called virtuous cycle.
Right.
Those activities you said were blocking and prioritizing service.
Blocking, prioritizing, requiring some kind of pay performance, degrading a service in order to offer a higher service,
Is that
favoring
going on
your
now?
own.
Are providers doing that?
So I think that what we've seen thus far is a series of instances. This whole thing started, for instance, when Comcast blocked BitTorrent and their folks from getting BitTorrent. We have seen instances where carriers have blocked or degraded the ability to get Skype because it's competitive to their voice service. We saw in the mobile world how AT&T blocked FaceTime early on after it was introduced on the iPhone. Because it was competitive. So the issue is that, yes, there are indications of these kinds of problems having happened in the market.
These things that you're talking about they could be dealt with through other laws, couldn't they?
Well, that's a really great question, Mr. Rice, and there
here's my problem.
There haven't been.
The Internet has been kind of a wild, wild west, it appears to me, and there's been a incredible explosion of innovation that's come out of the Internet. And when the federal government steps in and starts regulating, you will stifle that. You will stifle it far more than anybody else who's trying to block a competitor that could be attacked under any of these other antitrust laws. I would caution greatly against further federal regulation of the Internet.
Well, I think you have just hit on what the challenge is. Because it is clear that there must be an open Internet. That is what's necessary for the small business. That's what's necessary for the entrepreneurs. That's what's necessary for consumers. At the same point in time, communications carriers are investing $60 billion a year in infrastructure. And we have got to have that kind of infrastructure build out. And you don't want to put in place rules that would disincentivize companies from making that kind of continued investment.
And my point, Mr. Wheeler, is that the federal government, and I'm not picking on you, and you can put in whatever regulations that you want that can be the most well-intentioned things possible, but you will not be able to foresee everything, and you will stifle innovation. And the Internet has been a fountain of innovation that has helped to bring prosperity to this country and the world, and you will stifle that if you mushroom the regulation under Title II.
So the interesting challenge is that, as you know, most of America's major carriers have said we will adhere to the 2010 Open Internet rules even though they've been thrown out by the court. And in adhering to them, have continued to innovate and continued to invest. And that's the process that we want to see continue.
These things that you named that you thought were problems that you felt like you needed to add additional regulation for, can you name any instances of those occurring that could not be handled by other areas of the law like antitrust?
Yes, sir. I think that there is a significant difference between what is an anti-competitive behavior defined under the Sherman Act and what are the public interest obligations that the Telecommunications Act mandates that we deal with, and that while many issues may be able to be dealt with on an antitrust basis, not all issues, and the ability to deal with them with a public interest orientation rather than the strict construct of antitrust law is one that will go more to all of the issues and less to specialized issues.
My friend, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's working great. Let's please don't stamp it out. I'm a firm believer in the scariest phrase that you'll hear is, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. So let's do our best to keep hands off, and I, for one, will do what I can to keep the FCC from adopting Title II with respect to the Internet. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rice.
Ms. Hahn.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Velasquez, and thank you, Mr. Wheeler, Chairman Wheeler, for coming to our committee to talk about FCC and how it impacts small businesses. This might be a little different line of questioning, but I did hear the Broncos being brought up, so I'm going to bring up the Dodgers. As you know, Monday was a big day for the FCC. The Dodgers, City of Los Angeles, Time Warner Cable, and KDOC came to an agreement to broadcast the final few games of the regular season. And as you probably know, this entire baseball season, 70% of the region's viewers have been unable to watch the Dodgers. They only have 6 remaining home games to broadcast. And the impact it has on small businesses is something, I didn't realize until it started getting brought up to me. I was always just on the side of the fans and how unfair it was to have this dispute, not allowing fans to watch the games. But then I got a lot of calls into my office from small businesses, many of whom are restaurants, sports bars, who really depend on those local games being broadcast. A lot of times customers would call and say, hey, are you showing the Dodger game? And they'd have to say no. And it really did hurt their bottom line when this was happening. So I'm happy about this small breakthrough that happened. And I know you were instrumental in bringing all the parties to the table. And I hope you share my call that some of us in Congress had to have all the providers enter into binding arbitration so we can finally put this issue to rest. So I'm just going to ask you, how can we fix this arbitration process so disputes such as this don't go on for an entire season? Really, of course, crushing blow to the fans, but a lot of our small businesses really were impacted by this silly dispute. So I'd like to hear your comments on that.
I think you used the right descriptor there about when you characterize the dispute. I, as you know, wrote to the CEO of Time Warner Cable, which owns the rights, as well as to every one of the cable and satellite providers, saying exactly what you said. Can't we come together here? I got a little more specific with the CEO of Time Warner Cable because what's happened here, as you know, is that Time Warner Cable has purchased the exclusive rights to the Dodgers. And they purchased them paying a price that at least the media analysts say negatively affected their performance last year because the analysts claim they overpaid. And the other providers, the DirecTVs, the cable systems, et cetera, all said, well, wait a minute. I don't want to pay you're telling me that I'm going to pay this kind of a fully loaded price, or I can't get it at all. It doesn't make any sense to me. There's got to be a way to come together. So I'm happy that the decision was made, and for the last 6 games, this is absolutely terrific. And then it's into the playoffs, and it's a whole different contractual reality, and that's wonderful.
And on to the World Series.
But we got to. I wouldn't go that far, please. I'm a Dodger fan, but I'm
this is
also
our
happy
year.
to see
This is our year.
that the Nationals.
I want to
have
go on
gotten
record.
in.
This is our year.
But I have then opened up an inquiry, an investigation, with Time Warner Cable, because I want to know more about what's going on here. Because the reality is that a lot of money was put on the table to support an entity that's doing all right itself economically, and consumers ended up suffering. That's not right, and I want to know more, and so I've gone back and opened an investigation with Time Warner to find out exactly what the facts of this are. I have talked to each of the CEOs of each of the distribution channels, and they've all said to me, I'm ready to do it. I want to do it, but just because they paid a lot, why do I have to pay a lot? And we've got to get over that kind of hurdle.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that a lot. As you know, I think all the congressional members of the LA delegation had written to you asking you to get involved because we thought that would be helpful. And again, while this was a small step, this agreement, we need long-term to not put fans and small businesses at the mercy of these kinds of disagreements in the future. And I look forward to seeing how you're going to solve this.
Thank you, ma'am.
Dodgers Nationals series would be
It'll be okay.
Awesome.
That'll be all right. Hey, wait a minute. That won't happen. Sorry. Earth to Tom. That won't happen.
Mr. Lukemeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for being here today. And I normally don't read my questions, but I've got 2 questions I want to be sure and get to today, so I'm going to cut my own remarks short here so I can make sure I get to the questions. I've heard from many small business owners in my rural Missouri, which I represent, with little or no access to high-speed broadband, and I've recently written to you, Mr. Chairman, on the subject of Connect America Fund 2. I'm concerned that if we do not set the floor for support at a reasonable speed, such as megabytes per second, that for years to come, most of the rural constituents in my district will be left on the wrong side of the digital divide. As you've not yet responded to my letter, which I wrote to you August the 15th, I wish you'd address to the committee today with regards to the speed requirement you set in your Connect America Fund 2 order, that it will provide support for adequate facilities based on high-speed broadband for the small businesses in rural America looking to compete in the global economy with their urban competitors, number 1. Number 2, in addition, the Connect America Fund is for deploying broadband in rural areas currently served by large price cap carriers. The long-term Connect America Fund program for those carriers was supposed to be in place almost 2 years ago. When you consider the hurdles the FCC has faced to implement Connect America Fund for just over a dozen larger carriers, how long do you think it will take to produce a Connect America Fund program for the smaller carriers? And is there a way to do this on a faster basis? If you could respond to that, please.
Thank you. First of all, I apologize. I didn't realize that we're a month from a letter that you have written us. That is inexcusable. I'm normally a zealot on getting quick responses.
We were in recess, so you probably thought we wouldn't do that.
I doubt that, So first of all, we have proposed increasing the throughput in order to get universal service funds from 4 megabits per second to 10 megabits per second for precisely the reason that you mentioned, that you can't have a digital divide. When 60% of the Internet's traffic at prime time is video, and it takes 4 or 5 meg to deliver video, a 4 meg connection isn't exactly what's necessary in the 21st century.
Right.
And when you got a half a dozen different devices, wireless and other connected devices in a home that are all going against that bandwidth, it's not enough. So what we were saying is we can't make the mistake of spending the people's money, which is what universal service is,
Right.
to continue to subsidize something that's subpar. As I said that before, the comments on this have just closed. I'm hopeful that by the end of the year we'll be able to have that issue tidied up. On your second issue about the rate of return carriers, it gets much more complex, unfortunately. You know, the rate of return carriers serve less than 5% of the population, but get 50% of the high-cost allocation because their situation is so unique and costly. And muddling around with that has higher potential opportunity costs. We have a proceeding on that as well that has multiple parts that include some suggestions made by the representatives of the rate of return carriers that we have put out for comment. That also has just closed, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get to that. I don't think we'll be able to get to it as quickly as the Connect America Fund, but I think it is an early 2015 kind of an issue.
Okay, one more question. As a result of the predominantly rural district I represent, I appreciate the agency's efforts to address the rural call completion problem that continues to harm rural Americans. When calls destined for rural business, hospitals, public service, whatever, are dropped before reaching their provider. Can you update the committee on the status of implementing the record-keeping and retention rules adopted last year? In particular, why haven't those been implemented a year after they were adopted? And when can we expect to see the rules finally put in place?
Great. A couple of things on that. One, we have been in active enforcement activities. We fined Windstream $2.5 million. We fined Level 3 almost $1 million because of their failure to deliver on the call completion expectation. We also had a proceeding in which we said we want to begin to collect data that allows us to get more granular to understand exactly where things are happening. That ran into two problems. Problem number one was that a bunch of carriers filed for reconsideration saying, well, these kind of connections you shouldn't look at, and redefine what you're looking at, and we had to go through that process, and that's now taken care of. And the other is, again, back to this, another OMB issue, where OMB had to give us permission under the Paperwork Reduction Act to go out and ask questions. Those have now both been resolved, and we're moving forward on the collection of data, which is going to allow us to get very granular on what the rules need to be.
Very good. I appreciate your candid remarks. And as a Cardinal fan, you know, maybe the Dodgers had a better team or better fan base, you wouldn't have those problems. But I yield back.
Mr. Barber.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Vasquez, for holding this important hearing, and thank you for being with us, Mr. Chairman. I'll steer clear of the sports analogies and go right to the issue that is significant in my district. I represent Southern Arizona, Tucson being the urban area, but all of Cochise County, which is one of the 9 districts in the House that is a border community with Mexico. And as I talk to people in my district, particularly in Cochise County and rural Pima County, which is where Tucson is based, I hear stories over and over again about the lack of access to broadband, wired or wireless. I was in Huachuca City just the other week talking to the mayor, who has a system that is archaic, so archaic it hardly works at all. And the situation is even worse in Tombstone, the famous Wild West City, the town too tough to die. And so we really have a desperate need for small businesses in my district, and I'm sure it's true in rural districts all over the country, to have increased access to broadband and to high-speed internet that they need. The economies of those communities relies on better internet service, and they just don't have it. So, Mr. Chairman, I have just 3 questions for you. I'll take them in order, and perhaps I'll give them all 3 to you so you can respond, and we won't go back and forth. With 12 million Americans living without access to broadband, could you share with us what the FCC's goal is for increasing broadband access in the next 5 years? and how are you engaging the private sector to meet that goal? And secondly, as you're talking to small businesses across our country, how are broadband speeds and broadband prices influencing their business strategies and decisions? And finally, Mr. Chairman, in a slightly different vein, cyber threats are growing every day. We have many briefings in House Armed Services Committee, in the Homeland Security Committees, on which I sit, about the threat and the hits that we are getting every single day. And our small businesses need to be aware of these threats as much as the big companies. They must have the security tools and the resources they need. So I'd like to ask Mr. Chairman if you could explain what kind of outreach the FCC is conducting with our small businesses to make sure that they're prepared. So if you could try to answer those in order, I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Robert. So there is no doubt you have to have high speed if you're going to play in the 21st century economy. The question is, as I said before in response to another question, that our universal service program was based on voice and based on supporting companies that provided voice. My predecessor, wisely, moved off of voice to focus on supporting broadband. The next question that we have to face is, as was previously asked, one, is that broadband speed fast enough? And two, are there competitive alternatives to get that broadband? So for instance, if on LTE, wireless LTE, you can get 25 to 100 megabits, should that be the solution to serving these kinds of areas? If you can get not quite as fast, but significantly faster than 4 megabits service off of satellite, should that be a solution? And so we're moving into a period where there are going to be competitive alternatives. We're also moving into a period where the existence of those competitive alternatives has an economic impact on the people who have traditionally provided connectivity to your area. And so it becomes this kind of a balancing act as to how we make this progress happen. But it has to happen. And then insofar as your cyber question, I could not agree more, which is one reason that we have published several brochures and tips and talking points for small business about how they need to be worried about cyber and how it's a real issue and what they can do. And those are available on the FCC website, and we promote their availability. But the bigger question is that whether it is the local, as I said, insurance agent, or the company that's providing last mile service, they are getting service from big network providers. And those network providers have to provide a level of cyber security in their networks. And we're working with them to develop both a set of standards that can be measured to, so that we can identify what issues are and hopefully remediate them, and to try and do it in a voluntary process so that we get as much participation from everybody as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for attending today.
Mr. Collins.
I've got a very rural district, Western New York, 8 counties. A couple of them have definite broadband issues, as well as, frankly, even cell phone coverage issues. But let's start with, we certainly agree, or I certainly agree, 10 megabytes should be the minimum download. There's no two ways about it. So the basic question is, under special access rules, it's 1.54 megabytes. And so it's a simple question that, since we all agree the minimum should be 10, and we all have to look at our priorities, why is the FCC continuing to deal at all with special access at 1.54 and new regulations and the like for what I'd call an outdated, obsolete service?
Well, 1.5 is what's called T1, and it is kind of the table stakes for interconnection amongst and between various carriers and businesses. Special access is not controlled by speeds. Special access is a carrier, normally a dominant carrier like AT&T or Verizon, selling services to others who need it, whether it be the local cable company, the local cellular company, or a rural telephone company, or others, who are typically competitors. And therein lies the rub. And so what we're now finally getting in a position to be able to do is to have the data, because we were prevented from getting the data that you got to have to make this decision. Having the data that enables us to address just how can we make sure that there is a fairly priced, readily available, sufficient capacity, to your point, special access available for these competitors. And that's what our rule is all about, and by the end of this year, we're going to have the data that's going to allow us to be very granular on that.
So in my remaining time, let me ask you one other question on the data. My county, Orleans County, one of ours, if you look at the FCC, I think they would say that county has 95% access to broadband. Mm-hmm. But as I've determined, that data is in many cases driven off the last 4 digits of the 9-digit zip code. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the way some of them are served, by definition, if a single customer in that last 4 digit of the 9-digit zip code, if a single customer has access, it's deemed every customer has access. And so they're actually paying right now with another county to do a joint study where they believe their access is in the 50 to 60%, where because of that nuance in the definition of the data, with good data we make good decisions, with bad data that's not the case. Are you aware of that very interesting nuance, and what are we doing about it?
And one of my mantras has been we have to have data-driven decisions.
I agree.
And if it's garbage in, it's garbage out.
Right.
And so there's a couple of things that are interestingly going on. The National Broadband Map, which we have recently taken responsibility for from NTIA, has these kind of anomalies in it, in large part because the information is submitted, not collected. And there's a significant nuance there when we're saying, you tell us what's going on rather than us going and finding. But the other interesting thing that's happened with the Connect America Fund in the process that we've now established for Phase 2 is that people are able to challenge whether or not there is service. A potential competitor is able to challenge and say, well, no, wait a minute. There isn't service. You say there isn't. There is. There is or there is. Either way. Mm-hmm. And that is helping us enrich the map as well. But I agree with you, sir, that if you're going to be data-driven, you got to have good data.
Well, speaking for the counties, they're actually paying their own money to do another study to try to disprove the 95% that's
I look forward to I thank you for doing that. I look forward to their results.
Okay, very good.
Okay.
Thank you for
Thank you, Mr. Collins.
Okay.
Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our ranking member. Let's see, Mr. Wheeler. During your testimony, you mentioned that the FCC is reviewing diversity issues to see how best we can promote the diversity of voices, including women and minorities.
Yes, sir.
Can you elaborate on this process and how the FCC believes they can accomplish this goal?
Yes, sir. We're in a situation right now where, let's talk about broadcast properties for a second. When you've got less than a couple of % of the broadcast properties in America owned by minorities, something's wrong. And when I came in, here's what I found. There was a game being played by Washington broadcast lawyers that said we will create all kinds of fancy legal structures that will allow companies to combine in an individual market, where we have a rule that says there's one licensee per market because we want to have diversity of voices and diversity of ideas and diversity of ownership. We will allow the creation, we will construct these creations where the company doesn't really own the license, but they get the use of the license, and they can get around the rules. And what that had the process, the impact of doing, was chasing out small business opportunity, because the big guys were able to outbid, and the big guys were able to have economies of scale, and the big guys fixed it. It was done through a structure called JSA, Joint Sales Agreements. We came in and we changed that rule. There was a huge hue and cry. Oh, it's the end of broadcasting efficiencies. Oh, you're going to really hurt small business and minorities because we're so good to them. And we went ahead and did it, and we were supported by 20 different minority groups saying this is the right thing to do. And Congressman, I'm happy you asked that question, because I'm happy that I can sit here today and say that last week I was at the commission when people were coming through, led by Minority Media and Telecommunications, talking about how they were now minority owners of broadcast outlets that came on the market because of our change in this rule. And it's not enough, but it's a start. And I also think, by the way, that the whole issue of open internet is crucial. And the opportunity, I'm going up to as you know, Mr. Rush is on the Telecom Subcommittee and Energy and Commerce, and he's asked me to come up and meet with a group of entrepreneurs in Chicago to talk about how to use broadband to create opportunity for minority entrepreneurs. We're working on workshops at this for across the country that we webcast across the country at the FCC. But I think there's also great opportunity in an open internet for small business and minority entrepreneurs.
Well, I appreciate that effort moving in that direction. And, you know, for me, it's not so much about a preference as it is leveling the playing field. As you say, you know, a bunch of Washington lawyers got together and crafted something that would not allow certain individuals to be able to compete. So I applaud those efforts and hope you continue to move in that direction. And with that, I'll yield back.
Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the ranking member as well. I'd like to thank Chairman Wheeler for appearing before us today. And quite frankly, I want to associate myself with the comments of Mr. Payne, and will be looking forward to your continued advocacy in this regard. Because when you look at the fact that there 7% of full power commercial stations are owned by women, and that there are just 2.2% minorities that we comprise 40% of the population. Someone's got their thumb on the scales, clearly.
I was hoping Mr. Tipton would still be here, and tell him when you see him. One of those, an outfit called Chang Media, which is now the only Asian-owned broadcast outlet in the United States, is now operating in his district, and it's operating as a result of this rule change that we just talked about.
Outstanding. Well, we want to encourage your continued support of those endeavors. Well, my district has access to broadband. I'm from Brooklyn, New York, but it has serious adoption and digital literacy gaps. These are the skills that are essential for participating in the 21st century economy. So I'd want to hear from you what you think FCC can do or is doing to address this concern, and how will E-rate modernization affect these gaps?
So I think you just raised the key issue here with E-rate. I'm old enough that I took shop class in high school. I don't even think they offer shop class anymore, right? There you go. Okay. But it was deemed important that I learn how to work a metal lathe, right? Which hasn't exactly helped me in my activities to date. But I had that hands-on experience. The thing that was really exciting to me about what the E-rate has done is that it is giving students an exposure to the internet and the use of computers that is not, well, we're going to go to computer class now, but it is, you've got to live with it. And this is how we all learn things. And you get the 21st century skills by doing 21st century things every day in every class. And so what we've done in the E-rate is we came in and identified that there was a huge problem, that E-rate was doing a very good job of getting broadband connectivity to the school. About 2/3 of the schools in America are connected by fiber now. But it wasn't doing a good job getting connectivity to the student. And how do you have each student have Wi-Fi access? So we identified what we called the Wi-Fi gap. And we found $1 billion this year and $1 billion next year that we've targeted specifically for Wi-Fi in schools and libraries, and specifically made sure that it does not cannibalize the money that's used for the important connectivity in the first place. But if, as a result of that, students in their everyday classroom activities are becoming digitally literate just by repeated use, by repeated exposure, then I think we have sent them out after graduation with the skill sets that are necessary to exist in a 21st century economy. And it's happened by osmosis. And that's the best way to learn something.
And you know, in terms of the embrace of sort of the Wi-Fi and making that available, has there been any real pushback? Because I could certainly see those who offer Wi-Fi for a fee being concerned about, you know, the competition.
But they haven't. Fortunately, they weren't offering it for a fee in schools, and it wasn't there. And there has been. I mean, I'm actually quite proud of this, Ms. Clark. That one of the things that we also did was, you know, there's a small amount of money. $1 billion is a small amount of money, but there is a finite amount of money, and we were able to get the schools in America to be able to piggyback on the GSA contracts for Wi-Fi access points. You know, the largest purchaser of equipment in the world.
Right.
And now the schools in Brooklyn, you know, or in Missouri can get pricing for their Wi-Fi equipment that is the same price that the U.S. government pays, not through a federal purchasing program, but just through a structure that we were able to create. And that in itself is going to drive more Wi-Fi into schools and libraries.
Well, I thank you very much once again, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Graves, I yield back.
The Internet's obviously flourished the last 20 years, and it's fundamentally changed how small businesses are and small firms are doing business, nationally and internationally. And preserving that is obviously something that is pretty important to me. And I do have some concerns about how more heavily regulated Internet's going to affect small businesses. But my question to you is, have you considered what the proposed net neutrality regulations are going to do to small businesses, and have you sought out the input from small businesses? And I'd be curious what that input is.
Yes, sir. In multiple ways. As you may have read, we've had 3.7 million comments filed in this document. There has never been more public input to something that the FCC has done. And they are wildly in support of open Internet requirements. I have probably received myself tens and tens of thousands of emails addressed to me. And a lot of them, you get things that are like them too, that aren't exactly the ones you want to show your mother. But I look at them, and the ones that I've been most interested in are the ones from teachers and small business people who are saying, I am a small business person in so-and-so. Let me tell you how this is important to me and why it is important to me. I have met with startup companies and venture capitalists in Silicon Valley as well as in Silicon Alley. In Brooklyn, as a matter of fact, is where the meeting was held. And sat down with them and said, as small business people, as entrepreneurs, as the lifeblood of growth, let's talk about how this works. So yes, sir. And I also, I guess, would add that even if I hadn't done any of that, I bring 30 years of experience as a small business person, including the scars of my companies being denied access to networks. And I'm a fervent believer in open Internet.
Any other questions? Ms. Clark?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have one more question for Chairman Wheeler. While the FCC included initial RegFlex analysis, it looked primarily at small entities in the tech and telecom industry. I recognize these industries will be impacted, but I'm concerned about the 28 million small firms that utilize the Internet in one way or another for business purposes. Has a similar analysis been done to look at the effect on small firms as end users?
This is in the open Internet proceeding? Yes, we have specifically asked questions about that. And we also have proposed an idea, which is a unique idea in the history of the agency, and that is that how does a small business who doesn't have the cash to hire a Washington lawyer to go represent them before the FCC get their voice heard at the FCC? And so we have proposed the creation of a small business ombudsman at the FCC to, on an email, be able to advocate, to find out the facts and advocate on behalf of this small business.
Good answer. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, ma'am.
Based on your experience, and because I've been in this committee for 22 years, and 20 of them we have been dealing with the issue of the digital divide, especially for small businesses and rural America. And I hear you that you are involved in increasing the speed and deployment infrastructure for broadband. But what else can we do to increase or attract competition in rural America? Do we need policy, public policy, or what else do we need to do? Or do you have all the tools that are needed?
I believe that we have tools that are adequate, I'm not sure we have all the tools that are needed, or that would be nice to have. Let me put it that way. The challenge is, how do you recognize that one of the great things about the Internet economy is that there is no longer the telephone monopoly, that there are multiple ways of reaching people? And how do you provide the necessary incentive for-profit companies to do that, while at the same time recognizing that for the last 80, 90 years, there have been companies out there that have received some kind of a subsidy to enable them to offer services, and that they have entered into debt agreements, and they have hired people and made representations and this sort of thing. And so one of the most challenging things in this evolution is, how do you embrace competition in a way that is logical and responsible? And that's why we are supporting these trial projects, because I don't know the answer. I could sit down and hypothesize an answer, but I'd much rather have a market test, and that's what we're trying to do.
Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for testifying before the committee. As I mentioned in my opening statement, I'd like to see the FCC and this committee be partners moving forward and make sure that we keep the lines of communications open as we look at broadband and deployment, and make sure those obstructions are alleviated. But again, we appreciate you coming in. This is my last hearing as chairman of the committee, so it's
Well,
so thanks for being that individual.
it's a privilege to be your final witness, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Velasquez, thank you very much for inviting me today.
I'll be here.
You'll be. I have a feeling he'll still be here too, right?
With that, I'd ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to submit statements of supporting materials for the record. And without objection, that is so ordered. And with that, the hearing is adjourned.